Good evening. Welcome to tonight's lecture. I am Karen Taylor, Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. And I'm delighted to welcome both our in-person audience and our online audience to this evening's talk. This is the first in our Labour, Literature and Landmark lecture series for 2024. We have a very special presentation this evening, Made in America, the industrial photography of Christopher Payne, which celebrates manufacturing skills across the nation. Our executive director, Victoria Dengel, and I had the good fortune to hear this talk in a slightly different format in the fall. And we were so impressed with Chris's presentation then and his spectacular images, and knew immediately this was an absolutely perfect talk for our Labour lecture series. We are so pleased that Chris has agreed to speak here again and to welcome him back this evening. I also wanted to mention that Chris's beautiful book, Made in America, is available for purchase this evening for our in-person audience, courtesy of Suzanne from Books & Call at the front of the room. And of course, this book is also available through abrahamsbook.com for our online audience. For those of you who may be less familiar with the General Society, a brief introduction. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York was founded in 1785 by 22 artisans. Today, our 239-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. These include our library, of course, of which the in-person lecture is taking place in this evening. It also includes our John M. Mossman Lock Collection, which the audience in person is welcome to visit after this talk, and our Mechanics Institute, founded in 1820, our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, I should say, and finally, our nearly 200-year-old lecture series, of which, of course, tonight's talk is part of. Before I introduce our speaker, a quick reminder to mute your phones. Christopher Payne specializes in architectural and industrial photography. Trained as an architect, he's fascinated by design, assembly, and the built form. He is author of New York's Forgotten Substations, The Power Behind the Subway, Asylum Inside the Closed World of State Mental Hospitals, North Brother Island, the last unknown place in New York City. And I should also mention that Chris spoke on this book in 2014, 10 years ago. And finally, Making Steinway an American Workplace. His work has been featured in publications around the world with frequent special presentations by the New York Times Magazine. It's now my great pleasure to introduce to you Christopher Payne.
Thanks for coming tonight. This is one of my favorite places to speak in, and I guess it has been 10 years since the first lecture. So, most people I know have never stepped foot in a factory. Decades of global outsourcing, floods of cheap imports have decimated American factories and hollowed out once thriving communities. Today we have little idea where or how the shirt on our back was made. We do so much of our living, our shopping online, that we've lost touch with our analog roots. Yet we still live in a physical world and surround ourselves with material things. And many of these things are still made in America. As environmental concerns and the pandemic have become urgent wake-up calls to rethink global supply chains, I believe and hope that U.S. manufacturing is making a comeback. Through the past decade, with personal projects and editorial commissions, I've been on a photographic journey to learn more about what's made here. The traditional industries that built this country, as well as the newest and most technologically advanced processes. Some of these factories have by and large stayed the same by catering to niche industries, using vintage equipment to produce what's called the genuine article. Other places have reinvented themselves, often repeatedly, as new applications for their products have come into existence. And then there are the newest manufacturing facilities that have redefined the very concept of factory and creating opportunities that barely existed 10 years ago. All of these places share a commitment to quality and craftsmanship that cannot be outsourced. And there is for sure a certain romance in the idea of making things here domestically, but it's no longer entirely nostalgia. It's also necessity and opportunity. Good, things are working. In 2010, I discovered an old yarn mill in Maine that reminded me of the state hospital workshops that I'd photographed for my book, Asylum. And while those places had long been abandoned, this mill was fully functional, a scene from the past miraculously coexisting with the present. I returned to the mill several times, and from conversations with employees learned about other mills that had survived, remnants of a once thriving industry that had long since moved south and then overseas in search of cheap labor. This is a view inside that mill. And when I was working on this, I didn't really know what this project was become. I was just so amazed that a place like this could still be in existence. So I started befriending the mill owners and the workers, and in addition to opening their doors, they would also inform me, they'd call me up informing me of a colorful production run, which could turn a very drab, monochromatic scene into something magical, like this one here. And this is funny, and you all from New York will appreciate this, but when this was happening, the day this was happening, the mill owner called me up and said, "You might want to come up today. We're running pink." And I already had the shot in a different color. And I remember thinking how amazing my parking spot was right outside my apartment. And that I would have to give that up. But I did, and it was worth it. So I met these mill owners, and they were very generous with their time, and they're also very frank about persevering in an economy that had turned its back on traditional manufacturing. And I remember there was one shirt factory I toured in Massachusetts early on, and he said, you need to come up and to this factory. I want to show you, there's a room I want to show you. And in it, you can capture the entire arc of the textile industry in America. And I got all excited because I was thinking that it was going to be a room full of antique equipment that hadn't been used in generations, and I was going to get something that was akin to a Lewis Hine photograph. And he opened the door to this vast hall, and there's nothing in it. And he looked at me, and he said soberly, he said, "Gone to China." My project also took on this sort of archaeological turn because I was talking to people who'd worked at the mills their whole lives, their parents, their grandparents before them. And it was like talking to them, you could look all the way back into the 19th century. And that was a time when the textile industry was the engine that drove the American Industrial Revolution. And probably more than any other textile image I made or wanted to make, this was the one that kind of epitomized what I was hoping to find. And this was a place in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, Maypole braider. These are Maypole braiders, and they had floors of these things. And I remember calling the guy up, and I said, "Are you still using these things?" I said, how many do you have? And he says, "Oh, we have about 2,500. And I was up there the next day, and This was the kind of place, because it was family owned, he literally would give me the keys to the place and, tell the security guard I was there and say, turn off the lights when you're done. And stepping through into a room like this was like going back in time 50, 75 years. There was really very few places like this left. And what was so beautiful, what I realized I enjoyed so much about photographing a space like this was it not just because it was intact, but it's because these machines, these braiders that make shoelaces and things like that, were so purposefully designed, and they were beautifully designed. And there was that wonderful balance of form and function that you just don't see nowadays with modern equipment. As much as I enjoyed searching for and discovering old textile mills, I knew I could never reconstruct the past. And fortunately, I found more of what I was looking for right here in New York City at the Steinway Piano Factory in Queens, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. I first toured the factory in 2002 when I was still working as an architect. And I thought about what I'd seen for many years, but I didn't really possess the vision or the skill set to do anything with it. After my grandmother and my father passed away, they were both pianists, the factory took on a much more profound spiritual importance, and I felt obligated to return to this place that had such a deep connection to my family. And there were two moments, two images that were kind of like embedded in my mind that I thought about for those 8 years. And one was this view looking down through these piano rooms in this drying room where they keep them there for, I forget, maybe a period of weeks or months to dry out after they've been bent. And what appealed to me was just the fact that these instruments created a space that you could walk through. What's ironic is that, I thought about them for 8 years, and you think that in an old factory, you're gonna have all the time in the world. But it is no longer possible to make a picture like this because they've come up with a way to brace the pianos to make them very straight while they're drying that obstructs this view. And so even though you think you have all the time to do something, things always change, especially in factories. The other picture moment that stood out in my mind was the rim bending, when the workers take these long sheets of 1/4 inch or 3/16 inch maple and they lather them up with glue and they stack them on top of each other, and then they wrap them around this rim press. And the design of the press was patented by Steinway. And it's basically has been unchanged since the 1880s. And I loved seeing that. It was really moving to see these humble materials come together in this messy way, and then a few hours later, they'd take it out, and there was this iconic shape of the piano. And so in this basement room in Steinway, this humble place, these soon someday, to be made pianos would find their way to magnificent concert halls around the world. And the kind of manufacturing that happens at Steinway, where people are transforming these raw materials into some of the finest musical instruments in the world, has nearly vanished in the American workplace. And it's something that kind of, fuels my interest as throughout the years. What you're seeing is something that doesn't really happen much anymore. And I remember also when I was shooting this, making this picture, I have dozens and dozens of pictures of the rim bending. And because I just thought it was so interesting, but I realized early on that often the most interesting processes like this are not necessarily the most photogenic. And it's something I've had to learn the hard way, and I still learn it every time I go out and shoot, that I want to photograph process, but that often doesn't always make the best picture. And so this sort of rim press without the piano in it or the people is something that I sort of keep coming back to, and I think helps explain a story that is kind of impossible to capture in still photos. The benefit of photographing at Steinway is that the piano is instantly recognizable. And the factory, yes, it's cluttered, but everywhere you have bits and pieces of pianos that are instantly recognizable. And so my photographs, as I was working on this project, tend to look, instead of looking at the whole, they're a deconstruction of the whole into its constituent parts and a glimpse into the hidden choreographies of production. The wonderful thing about the factory is that it really is, it has the smell, it has the sounds, it has everything you'd expect in this old factory, and then these, iconic shapes everywhere. But even with that, even as tempting as it was just to photograph the factory, I realized that I needed to go tighter and tighter and tighter and try to find those moments when the piano is still recognizable but seen in a completely new way. So these are soundboards that are drawing. And these are, well, this is a little bit of a detour. I decided to put this in because I said, what the hell? This is actually in Ohio. This is where they pour molten metal to make the frames inside the Steinway piano. And the great thing about Steinway is that they not only make the pianos essentially from scratch in Queens, but they also own a foundry in Ohio. And in this day and age, you don't normally see things cast in the United States. And so I went out there and made this picture. I think we made this picture, it was about 1 a.m. because that's when they get these, the furnaces going. But it was an incredible experience. Anyway, I threw this in because there's nothing better than seeing sparks, especially with a long exposure. And here are keyboards lined up for polishing. They don't use ivory anymore at Steinway. They actually have a room where they keep their old ivory keyboards in case they need to restore an old piano. But seeing them new is just gorgeous, seeing them lined up like this. Along the way, I love making portraits of people who are masters of their craft. And I took many portraits at Steinway. And one has a tendency to gravitate towards people who are either kind of outwardly charismatic, or they seem to be photogenic, or they're just chatty. And this gentleman here was very shy. And the foreman pulled me over one day and he said, "You really need to get a picture of Rebert." And I said, "What do you mean? He doesn't talk to me. He doesn't like me." He says, "Well, he feels left out." And so it's just funny that, sometimes the people who make the best portraits are in the beginning, the ones you least expect. Well, being able to focus on one subject in one place like Steinway was deeply satisfying. And it's something I've been able to replicate for many years here in New York City, beginning with substations that powered the subway and then North Brother Island. But as this worked, as you can see, I've migrated from things that are abandoned, derelict, to sort of more of a celebration of things that are happening now, even if they're still old. Another place that I was able to weasel my way into was the New York Times printing plant. And even with the support of the New York Times Magazine, with whom I frequently work, it was still very difficult to get in. It took about 5 years. It's just a different world out there. But it's worth it. It's putting that time in the front is always worth it, because once I was in, I could pretty much come and go as I pleased. The place like the printing plant, it was the most challenging place I've ever photographed. It's vast, it's chaotic, it's overwhelming, and even though they do essentially the same thing every day, print papers, it's always different. The papers are always different. The presses, they use different presses. They configure the presses differently. The sizes of the sheets are different. The colors are different. And so if you don't get it right then, it's gone forever. And I remember when you walk in, after I sign in, there's a long hallway, and I'm wheeling down my equipment, and I'm trying to get excited, trying to get my mind wrapped around the shoot. And that hallway is lined with vintage black and white prints from the 1940s and 50s, kind of the golden age of newspapers, when the workers, they look like they're out of a Hollywood film. They've got the little newspaper caps that they made them out of newspapers. They've got their dungarees on, and they're kind of bell-bottom denim pants, and they're all muscular, and the presses are completely visible. You can see everything, And I'd walk by these things and trying to think like, trying to want to recreate the shots I wanted with the textile project with, like a Lewis Hine, like this is my Lewis Hine version. And, things like that just don't exist anymore. And I remember walking around this plant for hours, just kind of knowing what I wanted, but not being able to get it and leaving that day in frustration without anything. And that happened, for a couple of years. But there are a few pictures that would keep me going when I made them. And one was that I realized these presses are so large that the pressmen actually have to inhabit them. And coming from my architectural background, that appealed to me much like the piano rims lined up. These guys and women would actually get inside the presses to pull the paper through, the web of paper through the rollers, and they would inspect them. And so conveying that sense of scale without actually showing, the entire press room, and also intimacy and showing these guys in there was something that I loved to do. Here's another shot of a worker cleaning a press. They would clean them once a week. And I made sure to get him right in the beginning of the shift when the Tyvek suit was clean. By the end, it was very dirty, and I wanted him to stand out. If there is one shot that I think of as the quintessential shot, and for every project I shoot, every place I go, I really do believe that there is one picture that your mind just kind of keeps coming back to. Steinway, it was that view down the rims. For the New York Times printing plant, the essential part of the process is the paper going through these rollers. This is what we remember from the movies and things. And I was obsessed with this shot. And this was a long, very, very long exposure. And the amazing thing about these presses is that they're churning out. You're looking at something that is moving. It's so insanely fast. They're printing 100,000 papers an hour. And they're letting me crawl around up there inches away from these things. And sometimes my strobes would set the press off and it would stop. And luckily I never, tore the web or messed it up, but there were some close calls. And I became obsessed with the shot because I knew that it was, it was kind of like that, the quintessential picture. And this is what ran in the magazine. But I actually went back because the pressmen told me, they said, once a year, we run this thing in the fall. It's called Triple Drama. And it's when all the theaters put out full-page ads for the productions. And it's big and it's colorful. And that's when you want to shoot it. And so every week, the communications woman there at the plant would send me a schedule of what was printing on what day. And contrary to popular belief, I wouldn't go there at night. I would go there in the morning when things were less hectic and when they would print the inserts for the Sunday paper. Travel and leisure, style, and then of course the arts, the big colorful sections that would get inserted on Friday. And so I got that call, and this is Triple Drama, where you see just fragments of some of the plays and musicals that were going on at that time. And like I said, once this press run was done, that was it. It'll never happen again. There's no way to recreate that. This is probably one of the few places that haunts me because I don't feel like I ever finished it. And certainly the plant has become like the Alamo. It's one of the last printing plants in the country. And when I started, it was very busy, but I noticed that over the years it was shrinking and shrinking, and now they've taken on other newspapers. But everyone there knows that this is it. And so kind of the burden I feel with these projects is that I'm never doing enough, and that there's always more that I could do, and this was one of those places. Another project that took about 5 years to get into to win the trust of the owners was this pencil factory in Jersey City. I made the mistake of pitching it to them initially as the last of its kind, and no company wants to be portrayed as the last of its kind. Ironically, when the magazine ran this, that's pretty much the title they used. But to get in, you don't want to, that's not the angle you want to use. You want to, promote celebration. General Pencil is one of the last two remaining pencil factories in the country. And while it was very easy to work there, because the scale was smaller and more intimate, and I could almost tell them what to produce. I could line things up in a certain way. They could hold production for me for a certain color. I still had to apply the same kind of rigor and focus as I did with the papers. And that means thinking about what are the most essential shots, what are the processes that distill the making of pencils, that really capture that moment, that aha moment. And I find myself going back many times to my architectural training, the way architects set up drawings, the way they think very orthogonally. And I find that in places as chaotic as I go, these big factories, where it's just you walk in and it's just chaos, is that how do I find that underlying order and geometry? And all the pictures you're seeing here, very few of them I nailed on the first try. I either researched them or sketched them out, or I did them repeatedly and came back, like this one, which I eventually realized I needed to shoot overhead to kind of bring everything into clarity, into focus. And this is the tipping machine where they put the erasers on and the ferrules. And this became the cover of the book. I could have shot this with different colors, but I realized that somewhere in this project you needed to have that anchor shot with the yellow pencil. I love watching the workers. I don't ever just show up at a place and bang out pictures. I spend hours looking at the snapshots, coming back weeks or months later. And one thing I'm always trying to go after is elegance, is finding that, setting up the shot, getting the composition I want, locking in the lighting, and then letting someone do their thing and capturing it when everything just looks beautiful, like they're a dancer. And so these are pastels that are being laid in these grooves to dry. The pastels are very, very fragile, and it all has to be done by hand. These are pencils being sharpened on a band of sanding paper at very high speed. It's one of those moments where you're like, wow, so that's how they do it. One of the things I've learned is that I don't have the resources of someone like Edward Bratinsky. I can't go all over the world. I have to make the worlds that are in my backyard look big and beautiful and mysterious. And one way to do that is to change your point of view, or to go closer and closer and closer until you find, to get to that moment where, it's like when you're writing, how much can you edit out and it still look like something that's recognizable. This was one of those shots. And this is an inventory shot. And I'm not a big fan of inventory shots because I think they're low-hanging fruit technically and creatively, but sometimes they tell the big story. And I think this was the kind of cover shot that they used for when the magazine did the photo essay. It's the kind of picture that leads the viewer in. In recent years, and often on assignment, often through editorial commissions, which are essentially paid personal projects that I come up with, I've been fortunate to visit factories that communicate sort of a more optimistic view of American manufacturing. And I've witnessed all kinds of things: the making of giant ships, satellites, airplanes, appliances, computer chips, electric vehicles, and even vials for the COVID vaccines. And what I realize, what makes me hopeful, is that there is this sort of common ground that's out there that is a balance of traditional manufacturing, traditional technologies, traditional products that are fused with kind of modern means. And I think that both of these methods can play a vital role in our economic well-being. This was something that I found kind of late in the game when I was working on my book. It's a Stern Pinball outside of Chicago. And it's the kind of thing, people say, where do you get your ideas? And I have to admit that my mother will send me kind of web links quite often, say, you need to check this out. But another time, a friend of mine was saying, dude, have you seen this? My son, he told me about this. And then they send me a link, and I'm thinking, how did this, get past me? But that's the fun of it. There's all this stuff out there that I haven't photographed yet. And so the wonderful thing about Stern Pinball is that, we all know what a pinball machine's like, and they've kept that. They've kept that, the visceral quality of it, the feel, the look and the feel of it. And yet when you kind of flip it over, it's all high tech. They've upgraded it, but they've kept the analog parts that need to be there. And yet when you go to the factory, a lot of it is still made by hand, and it's a beautiful thing to watch. And so this is what they call the game board. This is for Jurassic Park. And they put these boards on this rotisserie that they can rotate, and they can work on the front or the back. And this was another place that, they're happy to have me. There aren't necessarily proprietary concerns as you'd get in a really high-tech place. And it's the kind of place where, they stay as late as you want. The security guard knows you're here. That's the on-off switch. And just, we'll see you tomorrow morning. Another place that really has that nice balance between old and new is Martin Guitars. And I've been really fortunate with the New York Times Magazine, because when you work with these top-notch publications, they get you into places that you normally wouldn't be able to get into. And as much as I think doing a book is worthwhile, these days, saying that you're working on a book on American manufacturing isn't enough to kind of sway them. And so you've got to get that media backing. They want to know that your pictures aren't going to sit on a hard drive. Martin Guitar is one such place that really opened their doors during the pandemic to do this wonderful essay on building a guitar. And one of the things I love about working on manufacturing is that there's a story that's embedded. And granted, I have to go in there and kind of come up with the look and feel of it from scratch. But there's a beginning and there's an end. And so I know what the end is and I know what the beginning is, and I just have to put it all together. And I love working with the constraints of the broadsheet. And for this, we had to shoot everything vertical and distill it down into 21 steps. Another place that I photographed for the magazine was the Peeps factory. Place that had been on my bucket list, my to-do list for many years, and then Easter came around and they contacted me, and everything came together. Within 2 weeks, I was looking at these army of Peeps. And typically, I really like to dig into process and show how something's made, but with something like candy, you can't really show it. And their process is proprietary, but the view of just the conveyors of Peeps was just mesmerizing. So this is the marshmallow. These are the marshmallow Peeps before they are coated with the yellow sugar. And what's proprietary about their process is the way that marshmallow gets squirted out into the shape of the little chicken. And you can't see it, but I couldn't photograph it if I wanted it to, but it's very proprietary. And I remember that one of the lines there was down that day, and I had pictures in mind, the clock was ticking, and I was gonna get this straight shot of the conveyor with all the finished Peeps. And then one of the lines was down. I mean, and you're thinking like, well, can't you guys get it going? And they're like, it'll be up in half an hour. Half an hour later, it'll be up after lunch. After lunch, it'll be up a couple hours. Next morning, still not up. And I'm thinking, I'm not gonna get the money shot. Luckily, upstairs, they had a smaller line that wasn't as wide, but it had this beautiful S-curve in it. And I'd never seen that anywhere else. And I knew right then that was going to be much better than the shot that I had originally intended. And so I always try to go look at everything I can in a factory. I try to leave no stone unturned. Certain pictures I had in mind for my book that I'd already taken. This was a picture I made in Colombia for an article on candy. And I couldn't use it because it wasn't the United States. But a lot of candies are made, they're all made the same way. And I knew I could replicate it if I went to the Spangler factory in Ohio where they make dum-dums. And so this is a dum-dums mixture with the red. And it's one of those images that I do feel explains process, but also is beautiful. It's that sweet spot that I look for. The first section of my book is about traditional manufacturing. In part 2, I wanted to kind of jump to scale, to really focus on those traditional industries that are often overlooked because the products are used every day and they haven't really changed much over time. These are vast factories. These are places that I walk in and I get a headache. This is a Whirlpool factory in Ohio. Whirlpool has a lot of factories in the Midwest. The scale of these places is not to be believed. And unlike the printing plant, or the pencils, or Steinway, I've got maybe a couple of days. And so I have to use that training that I learned, working for the magazine about how do we distill the story down into a few essential pictures, which might not necessarily explain how something's made, but which are beautiful and mysterious and captivating enough to draw the viewer in and make them think, what am I looking at? Could that be a washer drum or a dryer drum? This is Kohler in Wisconsin. This was another factory that was on my bucket list. Another inventory shot, but because there was this similarity to meat carcasses, it was just too beautiful to pass up. The wonderful thing about a factory like Kohler is that they make cast iron fixtures, tubs, wash basins, lavatories, and they also make ceramics, toilets. So you have like a foundry, you have metal, and then you also have pottery. I don't know of any other place like that. This is the porcelain enameling. A lot of it's done by robot now, it's automated, but there's nothing more beautiful than seeing this done close up, with these guys using these sifters. And that tub was just a few seconds before that was molten, was glowing red. And they have to heat it up. And then they shake the porcelain on it, the powder, and it just melts right into that beautiful, shiny, durable surface. And then they put it back in the oven and they do it again. But I guess, what these photos don't convey is like the heat and the sounds, the heat that's coming off of that thing. And I knew that when I went there that I would juxtapose that shot of the hanging tubs with these, this toilet, which was made out of clay or porcelain. It's ceramic and it has yet to be glazed. But once again, I'm trying to show things that are instantly recognizable, but in a way that is new and refreshing. Another place on my list was John Deere in Iowa, and John Deere is synonymous with the American landscape. I was able to get into their construction division, and these are giant tractors. And so how do you show a tractor that you see every day on the side of a road in a different way? Well, when I encountered them being tested like this, up and down, side to side, I realized they look like toys. Trains are another thing that was on my list. As the second chapter was getting bigger and bigger in the size of the subjects, we see trains in the landscape, but we rarely see them inside a paint booth. And this is inside a train cab in the back. The thing is, you see these things all the time and you don't give them any thought. They're banal, and my job is to make the banal beautiful and poetic. And so that, and hopefully people will appreciate the sophistication that goes into these machines. So this is inside a train cab, and you can see all that wiring that is inside these giant machines, connecting the driver with the engine and the batteries. Airbus was my first big commission for the New York Times Magazine back in, I think 2016 or 17. And I went down to Mobile, Alabama to photograph a brand new factory where they were doing final assembly of the A320. And it was awesome. I got to go down there like 8 times. And we followed one plane from start to finish. And I loved it, but I was also frustrated because often the woman there who was in charge of, who was my handler, would only give me 2-3 hours per visit. And I'm walking around there and I'm like a kid in a candy store, and it's like someone saying you can only have one candy. And so I thought the photos were good, but at the end I just felt like I could do better. And so when we were working on the book, I decided to rephotograph the entire aviation sector. And the biggest competitor for Airbus is Boeing. So I went to Boeing and I made this picture, very similar to something I did at Airbus, but I think this was just a lot better because I had the time I needed to dial in exactly what I wanted. If there's one factory that I would like to go back to, it is Spirit Aerosystems in Kansas. They make the fuselages for Boeing. And so the thing that I love that keeps me going with this work, this is an ongoing project, is that you go to one place and then you find out about their suppliers. Or you talk to someone and they say, oh, you like this? So you really should go check this place out. And so Spirit makes the fuselages for Boeing, and it's one of the few places probably in this country where you can get a view like this, something that is kind of reminiscent of World War II production levels. And this was actually the same factory that I think made B-29s in the war. Not long after I took this picture, my camera cable actually broke. And that's one of the reasons why I want to go back. But I was fortunate to get this. This is another picture from Spirit showing a cockpit to a 767. And I love it because, we never think about how these planes are made and really what's under the skin. We're just so busy getting from point A to point B that we can't wait to get off these planes. But, they're very sophisticated and they're all built by hand, rivet by rivet. And this is the kind of picture that really is reminiscent, that pays homage to someone who inspired me, which was among all these other great industrial photographers, it was Alfred Palmer, who worked for during the war, basically for an extension of the WPA, photographing factories around the country. And he would do it in color, which was amazing, shooting on 4x5 color transparency film, and he used flash. And so he's photographing these young workers during the war, and the colors are just popping. And the beautiful thing, not only they're beautifully composed and beautifully lit, but it's as if someone is reaching through the photograph and pulling you back, 80 years. It just seems like they were taken yesterday. And so I want my photographs too to have that same kind of timeless quality. From Boeing, I got to GE. There's nothing more photogenic than jet engines. They're like giant sculpture. And GE, as the guy said to me, he put it succinctly, he says, we make big things that spin. And this was out in Indiana. And a lot of places I visited, they're actually sort of in these smaller cities that, as New Yorkers, we wouldn't really go to. But you go to these cities and they're, more often than not, there's a big university there. And so there's this, constant source of new young talent. And so you see people working in factories that you wouldn't normally expect. Young people with college degrees, some without, that are being trained on the job to do very, very sophisticated tasks. This is from Peebles, Ohio, where GE tests their jet engines. And, I couldn't just go to one jet engine factory. I had to go to Peebles. It's another place that the guy loves to tell me about it, but unless you have media backing and support, they're not going to let you in. And my fear, as I start working on volume 2 of this book, is that I'm exhausting the number of magazines, publications that want to work with me, because you can only publish so many stories about how things are made. You can only kind of spin the same story, in a different way so many times. This is a giant turbine in Schenectady. And originally I photographed something similar in South Carolina. So I'm down there and I'm making a beautiful image. Everything seems fine. I get home. Once the IP lawyers start looking at it, they say, well, there's something in there that you can't use it. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm down there. You said it was okay, but you can't argue with these guys. So yeah, I said, you know what? I'll go to another GE factory. So I went up to Schenectady and got something even bigger and better. And this is another one of those pictures that's, really evocative of like stuff from the 40s and 50s, Alfred Eisenstadt and Berenice Abbott, Charles Sheeler, Ezra Stoller, and Andre Kertész, and Maurice Greenfeld, I think, in the UK. All these other people they already did it, and they did it great, if not better. And the wonderful thing, the thing that I envy about them is they saw these places when they were new, and when the companies were eager to let you in, and when magazines like Life and Fortune would commission you, and when the companies would do big annual reports. Those days are gone. And so every time I get into a factory, I feel really, really lucky. Here's another similar shot of a guy in a stator of a GE generator. And I've been thinking about pictures like this for a long time. The person working inside the machine that they're putting together. And a similar picture I made probably 7 years ago was something like this, where the motor was much smaller in scale. But I always kept thinking about, the person inside the machine. I've also been fortunate to shoot some shipyards. And like many other industries, there aren't many ships made. Like many other industries in the US, the shipbuilding industry is not what it was. But they still make a lot of military ships in this country, and they make ships that carry goods from between US ports. This is in San Diego, and it's owned by General Dynamics. And the challenge with photographing places like this is they're just massive. And so the kind of creative control that I have in a place like General Pencil or Steinway is impossible. I have to kind of accept what's given me. And yet I still try to find those moments where the process is distilled down into a discrete step, where you're not seeing the finished ship, but you're seeing a small part of it that conveys the larger whole, like this one. And just as with airplanes, things like ships are entirely built up from hand, from plates of steel that are cut and then welded together and turned into larger sections and blocks, and these blocks are lowered in by cranes, and then they're welded together. There might be robots here and there, but a lot of it is really done by hand at human scale. From that story in San Diego, that General Dynamics shipyard, I was able to leverage that and play the long game and get into the General Dynamics shipyard in Connecticut, where they make nuclear submarines. I thought this was going to be the best photo essay ever. I couldn't believe it when I got in. Even the communications there was just like, I don't know who in the Navy likes you, but you got in. That said, you can photograph about 2% of what you see in a nuclear submarine shipyard, because most of it is literally top secret. You'll never see a submarine from the rear. You'll never see the propulsion, the propellers. And of course, you can't see sort of any of the armament or nuclear systems. But just being in the presence of one of these things is just, it's like looking at the Grand Canyon. It's so big that you can't believe that you're actually, looking at it or walking underneath it. A lot of the pictures I made were of steel being bent with sparks. You can never get enough. I can never get enough long exposures with the sparks. But you realize how essential the steel and the welding is with a submarine. We think of things being sophisticated that have to go into outer space. It's the same thing with submarines and the pressures that they must endure, thousands of feet below the sea. Nothing can go wrong. There's no way they can fix it on site. And so that welding has to be perfect. As with everything else, I was always looking for that one shot, which was beautiful, which distilled the project down into that, one view. And I got it the last day I was there. They had a hatch that they allowed me to photograph because this was kind of not sensitive information. And it was so beautiful, it looked like a Swiss watch. You know, and this is all stuff that's made there. They don't order it, they don't order anything from China. It all has to be built up from scratch. The third part of my book deals with the future, factories for the future. And the problem with this is that you're hitting kind of a moving target. And many of the places that I photographed are soon going to be outdated. And I'm also photographing things that are not instantly recognizable. You know, we all know what a piano looks like. We know what a guitar looks like. But what does a microchip look like? A semiconductor chip. We don't have that same kind of warm and fuzzy relationship with these things. And yet, the fabs, as they're known, these foundries, the factories for semiconductor chips, are some of the biggest, most sophisticated complexes on Earth. And it's just ironic that you have these they're enormous. And they're making these tiny, tiny little little chips. Some of the machines that etch the pattern into these chips cost $180 million a piece. And the foundry where I was at had 30 of these machines. They take a decade to build. So it's the same challenge. You're walking into a space that's vast, that's complex. Here it's a clean room. So I've got the whole clean suit on. And a lot of these modern factories look very generic. Once you kind of step back, you don't know what you're looking at. And so here's where I kind of resort to that architectural training, and I leave no stone unturned. This is a view in the basement of the fab where all the wires and the cables and the fluids and the power is going up into these machines. And I remember looking up and realized that this was sort of this wonderful balance of chaos and spaghetti and also underlying architectural order. I probably spent hours walking around, looking up, going a few more feet, looking up until I found that perfect, spot that kind of conveyed that balance of chaos and clarity. And how do you show, like I said, something that you can't see? Chip making is you can't even see how they're made. But they have these FOUPs that run around. They're called FOUPs. They're these little cartridges, and they run on these tracks. And when you walk into a chip fab, you feel like you're walking into the future because these things are whizzing by you on these tracks overhead all over the place, and everything's automated. And I knew I had to get a picture of that, but there was only one place in the entire fab where all of these tracks converge at right angles. It's kind of like those old shots of the elevated in Manhattan, those dangerous points where the L comes together in these curves. And this was it. To make this picture, I actually had one of the technicians slow down and divert these FOUPs so that they would appear on the tracks that I wanted. And then later on, I could layer in different takes to create the image I wanted. So I knew exactly what I wanted beforehand, but it took us a while to get there. And it was a wonderful instance where they not only were excited to have me there, but they were like, what can we do to help you make the pictures you want? Occasionally, you will see moments where there's this wonderful combination of people and technology. This is a wafer sorter. Another instance where they had to manually override the sorter to get everything right where I wanted it to be. And we had to light it a certain way, and it was one of those things that I knew I needed to get it. I had the final image in my head. It just took us a while to get there. Glass is is another thing that figures prominently in the book. And I spent a lot of time up at Corning. It's this ancient material that is being used in new and exciting ways. If you're interested more in it, you can read the latest issue of National Geographic that features a lot of these photos in that. But up at Corning refers to itself not as a glass manufacturer, but as they're a material science researcher, as well as making a lot of glass. The challenge with glass is that when it's working right, it doesn't look like anything. It's clear, it's thin, you don't even see it. It's embedded in all the things we use. And if you can see it, you probably can look through it. So how do you light it? There were a few factories I photographed. This is Corning. and where the glass starts out really big and it's frosted. And here we could light it as a sculpture. And it was probably the favorite picture I made of all the pictures I've made of glass. This is probably my favorite. And it's that perfect balance of information, beauty, technology. It's a process that I took photos of, but it's proprietary. So I could never show those pictures, but I could show this. And I feel like it's all you need just to kind of stir up a sense of wonder and mystery. This is something I made for the New Yorker magazine during the pandemic. I got to photograph the vials that were being made for the vaccine. And Corning came up with a way to strengthen those vials so that they wouldn't break or delaminate in transport and while they were being filled. This is a very, it was a difficult shoot because we all had, protective gear on, and I couldn't slow down production. But it was very moving because, I was witnessing something that was going to touch the lives of millions. This is a cover of a shameless self-promotion on my part of the February issue of Nat Geo, showing bendable glass. This is glass that I believe is used on the new Samsung phones. And they shipped this over for us from Korea for this shot. And it looks very bendable and it is rugged, but if you bend it in a certain way, it'll shatter. And so that was a challenge, but then also lighting it. And if you move the glass just a fraction of an inch, it throws the light off and then it's clear again. And so it was one of those instances, I walk in there and I'm feeling like, I got this down, I'm pretty good at what I do. And I felt like a complete amateur when I was shooting this, because it's just like you're doing everything right, but at the same time, you're kind of just hoping something will stick. And it did, eventually. My favorite kind of pictures are probably these environmental portraits that fuse a person who's a master of their craft, working inside the machine, and I'm capturing them at their peak moment of elegance. A lot of things that I've found, especially in these modern factories, is that they're not all automated, and even though they might be making something that is very technologically advanced, the means to get there are still human. And so this was made down in Georgia, where they make a carbon carpet that is it captures the carbon captured carpet, and yet the means to get there to kind of come up with the prototypes is still very traditional. Some of the places I visited were enormous. This is a wind turbine plant in North Dakota, which I was stupid enough to go visit in January, where it was just like another world. But here, once again, you see these, just these things are like 200 feet long, and yet you've got people climbing inside them, layering in sheets of fiberglass. And so even though automation is taking hold, in places where you still need a sense of intuition and flexibility, that human touch can never be replicated, and it's easier to retrain people than it is to kind of retool an entire assembly line. In the last few years, and here's another shot of that, once again using circles. You can see that I love to use circles a lot in my work, and I will photograph them, especially straight on whenever I can. In recent years, the industrial landscape has been energized by the pandemic, supply chain woes, competition with China, national security issues, energy concerns, and federal legislation. There's been a seismic shift in EV manufacturing, and this has been a windfall to car companies, and they're creating entirely new manufacturing ecosystems that combine manufacturing with battery production and recycling. This is the Ford EV Lightning factory in Detroit. This is out at Rivian in Illinois. The thing that I did find is that these factories look pretty much the same as a regular auto factory. They're just swapping out, the old motor for a new one. And so it's trying to find those needles in the haystack, the perfect leaf on a giant oak tree that kind of sums up a little bit of the process but captures beauty and something unique about that place and that process. This is an electric bus factory out in California. None of my photographs are spontaneous or kind of random. I don't just stumble on something and say, oh, that's good enough, that's perfect, leave it as it is. I see something, I like it, I take snapshots, I think about what it should be, I sketch it out. And then in this case, we went back the next day and I was able to photograph these guys, put them where I wanted them and photograph them when they were all welding to get what I considered to be kind of like the quintessential shot. Aerospace is a huge thing. It's a huge industry. I wouldn't even call it an industry. It's a whole sector that's happening now in the U.S., everywhere in the world. And so it's one of these. It's another moving target. I was fortunate to photograph a few places. This is a 3D printed rocket factory in California, and where they build it up layer by layer with metal with this laser. And to make this picture, I actually had to shoot it remote controlled because the laser gives off very harmful UV light. And so if you're not completely covered, within 15, 20 minutes, your skin will be burned like a sunburn. And so we had to set the camera up and then work behind a protective screen. Aerospace is another, not only do you have like the proprietary issues, but it has to be perfectly timed. This is a satellite this is a GPS satellite made by Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin makes all of our kind of weather satellites, our GPS satellites. And if you don't time it right, you don't know what you're looking at. It's a bunch of, futuristic looking things. I shot this in 2019 when it was still in pieces, and then I returned earlier this year. I had a few hours. They gave me a few hours when the satellite would be deployed with its solar array opened up like this, as you'd see it in space, but which you'd never see it on Earth. And so I was able to fly out there to Denver to make one picture. Another picture that I managed to squeeze into the book, as I was, we were basically done with the book. My editor was fed up with me because I kept, putting stuff in and changing things. And I realized I needed just a little bit more about robots, since that is a direction that, sort of the manufacturing sector is taking. And I found this incredible medical device manufacturer out in California, and they make surgical robots. And I pleaded with them to let me in. And they gave me, as with Lockheed, a few hours, and I flew out there, and I got one shot. And my editor was so fed up with me, he's like, I will put it in if you get the finished picture to me tomorrow. And so, I had to work on it in the airport and on the plane, but we got it in, and I think it made a wonderful addition. One of my all-time favorite examples of industrial design is the American flag, and I'll finish up with the shot, and thanks for bearing with me here. It was one of the most moving shoots I ever did, because even in its unfinished state, the American flag is instantly recognizable. It's a whole greater than the sum of its parts. And I'd like to think that factories are greater than the sum of their parts too, because everyone in a factory must work together towards a common goal. They're one of the few places left in this country where democracy still works. It has to work. Everyone must work as a team. And while it's been years since I photographed the small yarn mill in Maine that started me on this journey, I still feel the same sense of excitement and possibility every time I step into a factory. My photographs are a celebration of the making of things, of the transformation of raw materials into useful objects, and the human precision and mechanical precision brought to bear on them that give them form and purpose. They're also a celebration of teamwork and community. There are workers with soiled, stained hands, and others dressed head to toe in protective gear. They're skilled, unskilled, young, old, recent immigrants, and native-born Americans, men and women working side by side. These are the people who make some of the stuff that fuels our economy. And in this time of social polarization and increased automation, they give us a glimmer of hope. Thank you.
Chris, thank you so much. That was absolutely terrific. Fascinating to find out about your process and to admire the elegance of your photographs. We will now take a few questions, and I'll say a bit more at the end. Do we have any questions from the audience, from our in-person audience? And for our online audience, do feel free to submit questions.
Christopher is absolutely stunning photography. And as a photojournalist, I never have enough equipment. And I'm not going to go into the weeds about exposures and whatnot, but every picture is perfectly framed and the lines are parallel. And you spoke about earlier photography, which were view cameras where you could straighten lines. But what do you use and how are they turned out so perfectly? I mean, I guess they're digital because you don't carry your darkroom onto a plane like what your editor wanted for the next day, but it's really quite stunning. And if you could go backwards, it's not proprietary in one sense, but
No, that's a great. I started with all the stuff you saw that was Steinway and the textiles, that was shot on film. But you have to remember that with those places, I had a luxury of time and access, and a place like Steinway is kind of just inherently photogenic. When I moved on to the pencils, it was very small, and I thought about bringing my view camera in there. I realized that, not only could I not fit it into some of these places, but I couldn't light it the way I wanted it to, certainly with the printing plant. And I didn't have that, kind of creative control that I wanted with the lighting, being able to dial in the lighting just as I wanted it, which is something that digital has afforded me. But I still work with a digital technical camera. And it's kind of a burden that I have, that I feel that I have to set up the pictures architecturally, given my training. I just can't just shoot something and have it be that. If there's a geometry there, I have to let it, let it be the underlying structure. And so some days I feel like it's a real benefit to the way I see things, and other times I view it as a hindrance. Thank you.
All right, an online question. Since that medical device robot image was worked on in the airport to get it ready, I assume you're now shooting digital? And if so, when did you stop using 4x5 film? This is from Sal online.
I'd say a few, maybe. I was still using it for maybe 5 years ago. I mean, I still have the cameras loaded and ready to go. If I ever did another asylum book, I would go back to film. It's really just a matter of creative control and timing. I don't have the luxury of access to just wander around a factory like I did with my other projects. And so, yeah, it's been a few years, but it's always nagging me as something I need to get back to.
And related to that, this is from Shalom. What cameras do you use normally?
An Alpha technical camera and a Phase 1 digital back. Yes.
Chris, a few questions. Did you always enjoy photography? And and you're an architect. How did you move on to photography, and what was the genesis of this particular project?
I didn't start taking pictures till I was 30. And when I was working as an architect, and I was working on this book, the Substations book, which is supposed to be a book of drawings of old New York City machinery, electrical equipment, and the person who was going to take the pictures couldn't do it. And so, I'd been around photography my whole life, and I'd seen architectural photographers and view cameras, and I said, well, maybe I can do this. And so I would make sketches of this machinery, and I would, with the hopes that I would finish these drawings at home, and then gradually I'd take snapshots of those machines to kind of be the basis for the drawings, and then the snapshots became more and more complex, and I'm like, well, this is kind of fun, and since my friend can't make these pictures for me, the good ones, I might as well teach myself. But when I was growing up, I had no interest in photography, and this project specifically grew out of I'd say the asylum project, where I was finding these old hospital workshops that were intact, where they made shoes and clothing and mattresses and the farms, and that seemed to speak of a very environmentally sustainable way of life, like knowing how to do something that I feel every time I go into these factories. There's a sense of optimism and kind of, this sense of can-do-ness, and that I think has been lost in our, the digital age of online shopping. And my photographs are kind of a way to pay homage to that, to kind of get that back, that sense of, self-sustenance, which I think is not only just, the skill set, but also mentally, it's a good thing to have. But it was a long journey, and a lot of these projects, like, I thought that the pencils would be a book. I thought textiles would be a book. Steinway was published, but it was sort of published through my gallery and through Steinway. And then I realized, I said, why? Well, someone said, why not just do something on the whole country? And I realized, you got to play the long game. You got to play the big game, and you got to think big. And if you're not going to shoot for the sky, then there's really no reason to do it. But it was a very organic process. But once I was able to go to a few amazing places, I realized I could kind of connect the dots and fill everything in between. That was a very long answer to your question. I'm sorry.
Right, I think the gentleman over there with the question, and we'll just take a couple more questions, and I'm sure Chris will be happy to answer for the in-person audience your questions while he's signing your book. So I'll take for that gentleman, and I do see, okay, I'll take 3 questions, but perhaps we'll make the answers fairly brief, just so
Absolutely.
that because we want to get, yes, thank you.
And you can always ask me afterwards. I'm not going anywhere.
I was just wondering how seeing all these processes and production processes, I guess, has affected you as a consumer, maybe just as a regular person.
I definitely try to buy American when I can, and I try to buy less things, because most of the things that are made is just heading for a landfill. For this project and what I will be photographing, the list that's on my phone, that's 50 or 60 factories. All these places make things that are very useful and have long lives and that are beautiful and well made.
Okay, I have a question about some of these factories that you have visited in these remote areas of New England and whatnot. Have any of those factories closed since you went in and photographed them, or are they all still operating?
That's a great question. When I was writing the book, and I write about this in my essay at the end, some of those textile mills have closed. The one with the pink that you saw in the pink, that's gone. The one with all those braiders, that sea of braiders, that's gone. And it's not so much because of foreign competition. And this is something I didn't touch on in the lecture, but it's very important. And it's that no one wants to work in places like these. Young people are not migrating to factories the way they used to. And so you get these older owners, and they have no one to pass on the skill set to, the ownership, and they just get tired of doing it, and they call it quits, and the machinery gets sold off. And I often feel that the biggest impediment to a manufacturing resurgence in this country is not foreign competition, but it's from within. It's the inability to find people with vocational skills, because we've gotten rid of that. And yet a lot of people want to do this kind of work, but they don't know how. And so it was sad to learn that some of these places had closed, yeah.
First, I wanted to say thank you so much. This is amazing. Just curious, what are you going to work on next?
Volume 2. And some of these other projects I've worked on, I was able to let them go because I was creatively exhausted, but there's so much out there, and like I said, every time I go into a factory, it's exciting. So I hope I can line up enough, either a patron who will pay me to give up my commercial career, or keep finding magazines that will want to do essays on how things are made.
Right. Just one final question from online. How does the environment of the factory, noise, lighting, scale, speed of production affect your creativity, and or vision of a photograph? And that's from one online. Final question.
It's you never know what you're going to go into when you walk in there. There's usually the noise. Like I said, with some of these still photos, it's impossible to convey the noise and the energy of thousands of things happening simultaneously around you, and having to filter that out and get in that kind of creative zone. It's really challenging. And I know that whenever I go to a big factory, like one of the Whirlpool factories or the auto factories, after I scout that first day, I'm tired, and I'm physically and emotionally exhausted at the point where I feel like, I say to myself, how am I going to do this? Because it's just, it's a very intense, it's not like an art, you're not walking into this studio that you can work in and relax in and kind of get in your zone. It's constant bombardment. But when it's going well, it's an amazing energy to feed off of. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. What an absolute amazing talk. I feel like you covered so many topics. We could have been here for like 3 hours discussing some of the many things that you discovered. But basically, wanted to thank you for your enthusiasm, for you celebrating American production, and also sadly sometimes commemorating American production, but also looking to the future. It was an absolute terrific lecture, and to think that I thought that maybe you stepped into a factory, snapped a couple of photographs. How wrong could one be? You certainly highlighted the hard work, the creativity, and the thought that goes into every single photograph you take. And thank you so much for sharing that with us. We are very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we also want to remind you, and Victoria Dengel, our Executive Director, is going to say a few words, that this amazing book is available, Made in America, the industrial photographs of Christopher Payne. And this was available for purchase tonight, and I know that Chris would be happy to sign it for you. So I hope you will consider purchasing a copy tonight, also available online. And finally, just to say a few words, is Victoria Dengel, our Executive Director.
Thank you, Karen. And as many of you who are repeat attendees, Karen always leaves me with very little to say because she covers just about everything. But Chris, I just love this book. It's the second time I've heard the lecture. I'm going to think optimistically. I hope it will never be a commemoration of a American manufacturer. I do, like you, see that it really is a path to success for the country. It's success for employment, that anyone really, you illuminated something that's very important that we see in the construction industry, that people that work with their hands, whether artisans, that there's almost an immediate beginning, middle, and end, and there is great satisfaction in that. And for people looking for careers, I just can't say enough about, what you were showing, even with the teamwork there, and just, it's a meditative task when you do these repetitive tasks. So, and we need it as a country, and people need it as a job. And I hope that one day people understand, especially with college costs as they are, that you have to take a look at what other things exist. So your book is really a great, contribution to that cause. So thank you so much. And God bless America, of course.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay. Thank you again. Finally, Chris, a little memento, the poster. I'm now going to usher Chris to the book signing table. So if you do have any questions, I'll ask that you wait and ask them at the table. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Please join us for a glass of wine. And John Singer Sargent is going to be our focus next week, and this will be a purely online lecture. Thank you very much.